Good morning and afternoon, everybody. My name is J.R. Stormont, and I am the Executive Director of the FinOps Foundation. And the FinOps Foundation is a part of the Linux Foundation, which is we're a sister organization to CNCF, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. Today, we're going to be talking about FinOps. And FinOps is the practice of cloud financial management. We've got a great lineup of speakers who are both experts and practitioners and vendors in the space who are going to share their knowledge and expertise with you. And specifically in this, we are going to be focused around the aspect of how to do cloud financial management for Kubernetes in a container environment. So I'm going to start my screen share here and we will kick off. Excellent. So before we get started, I wanted to talk a little bit about the challenge of cloud financial management for Kubernetes, but why does this space exist? Why do we find that managing finances in cloud is a challenge? And I think where we have to start with that conversation is really going back to the world of data centers and what happened when an organization needed to get access to hardware. In that case, they would think of, what requirements they needed, what hardware they needed, and they would then go and build a business case and go to their procurement teams, right? And those procurement teams would essentially evaluate that business case, and they would come back with the money for the hardware that was needed. Now, in this model, there were pros and cons, right? So you had essentially engineers working as requesters. You had finance people or procurement people acting as approvers as part of this. And the good news was spend was really predictable. You knew what you were going to spend, you know how it was going to work. But the bad news was you had really long procurement cycles. And really there was a high cost of failure for projects, right? If you spent the money and then went to change it, it was already out the door. So this problem gets even more intense in a world where you switch from small groups of platform teams on the cloud to lots and lots of service teams, right? Service teams who are running lots of microservices, who are probably working across lots of different clouds, lots of different environments and development areas, and introduce another aspect there, which is software being written with infrastructure as a code. So suddenly these engineers can spin up resources wherever they need, whenever they want. And the entire dynamic shifts to this world where they can go straight to the money. Now the engineering teams and the ops teams essentially have the credit card that can buy whatever resources they need. So this makes the procurement people and finance people unhappy. And not only unhappy, it also puts them in a spot where they really can't do their fiduciary job to the company. So this is where FinOps comes in. FinOps is a way to essentially help solve this problem. It's an operating model that includes a prescriptive set of actions, of best practices, of culture, which essentially enable these teams to come together to work in ways they haven't before. Engineering teams, business teams, finance, procurement, giving them this common lexicon and a set of processes for chargeback, optimization, decisions, so that to that last line on the screen there, those teams can essentially figure out how to get the best value out of every dollar that they spend in cloud. That last line is really important because cloud financial management, FinOps, are not necessarily about spending less money in cloud. It's about making choices that give you the best outputs for that. Because in a lot of cases, we find that spending more in cloud actually may be successful, right? You're migrating more resources out or over to cloud, or potentially, your business is growing. So when FinOps is implemented, and we're going to talk a bit about what that looks like today, specifically in a Kubernetes world, some good things happen. So the first of those is these teams now start to act together as one. Instead of engineering operations teams running alone, doing their thing, and finance procurement teams trying to report on it later, they're coming together to make decisions. So you get that instant procurement, you get agility, but with predictable budgets and cost, and really lowering the cost of failure. So there's lots of names for this practice. Don't get stuck on it if you don't call it FinOps. You might call it cloud financial management or cost optimization. Mark Schwartz at AWS did a blog about FinDev. I think Corey Quinn calls it cloud economics. There's cloud cost management. There's all types of names. So these are all different words for ways to get that most value out of cloud. I'm going to refer to it here as FinOps because it's fast and short and easy. But in your practice, and the people that we work with and have met over the years doing this have literally hundreds of different titles and names for what they call this. But they all center around a core set of practical principles and a consistent set of stakeholders. So I'm not going to read each of these on here, but the idea with these principles, and these were developed with the practitioners within the FinOps Foundation and then in collaboration with AWS last year, are really focused around how do we bring those teams together to collaborate well so they can start to make those decisions. And a key thing, the third point, which we're going to talk a lot about here, and we talked a lot about at the Open Source Summit in June, is that you really want everyone to take ownership for their cloud usage, right? This is about driving accountability out to the edge so that those individual teams, and sometimes there's hundreds of them in an organization, can get access to accessible, timely, up-to-date, accurate, and granular reporting about what's happening, alerting, whether it be anomalies or reporting or anything else, or dashboarding, so that they can start to take actions. Now, the fifth point sometimes confuses people. A centralized team, where you just said we need to decentralize accountability. We still typically see a centralized team in organizations who are focused on driving those best practices, driving out the recommendations, driving out the reporting. That team is typically responsible for things like rate optimizations and reserve instances and savings plans and committed use discounts. And the idea here to the sixth is really to move everybody to a world where we're taking advantage of the variable model of cloud, right? Too often, migrations, whether they be newer sort of cloud native companies or those aspiring to be cloud native or older enterprise, end up running cloud really like a data center, right? They leave everything all the time, on all the time. So as part of this, as we see on the right, there are lots of different people involved, all coming together across the organization in order to really do this specific thing, which is to bring that visibility to drive better decision-making within the organizations. So what does that look like? Engineering metrics, there's a lot of things that engineering teams in particular track and are used to tracking and thinking about. Engineers don't like inefficiency. Typically, they're thinking about latency and memory and CPU and requests, all these different areas. For engineering teams, and we're focusing a lot of our efforts and conversations today around this group because of the audience of this summit, we need to start to introduce cost as a first-class citizen for engineering operations teams, architecture teams to consider as they are thinking about what they're deploying. Because now these engineering teams have the ability to make changes that actually can affect the bottom line of the company. So that brings us to what we're covering today, which is, sorry, my screen share just dropped off there, which is FinOps for Kubernetes. And I wanted to give you a little introduction to the FinOps Foundation and what we're going to be drawing on from here, because all the speakers that you're going to be hearing from today are a part of the FinOps Foundation, and all the best practices that we talk about are drawn from this group. So the mission of the foundation, which is now officially a program of the Linux Foundation, is to be a central community for cloud financial management. And this is regardless of what cloud you're using or what vendor or what management tool or open source or anything else. So we host a lot of virtual events. We've got another one this afternoon happening that I'll tell you about later on AWS Savings Plans. We've got an active meetup community around the world. We've got a Slack that's got a lot of folks having conversations. And these people come together to the second point to help advance not only the discipline, but also their careers. This is a nascent and evolving space. And we find that it's really hard to go say, hey, I need to hire a cloud financial manager or a cloud business office person or a cost optimization person. There's not a college program for that. There's not typically a dedicated jobs board, although if you go to our website, we do have a jobs board. So we do a lot of work around education, training, and development of these people. And the third area where we are very excited to be partnering with the Linux Foundation in this new chapter is building out open source standards around this nascent space. So this is looking like, what are the capabilities of a FinOps team? What sort of KPIs should they be looking at? What does a proper chargeback or allocation or tagging model look like? These are all now being built out in our GitHub repository and invite you to be a part of this process. So FinOps Foundation has been really exciting to see with very little promotion or sort of marketing behind it. It's had some pretty exciting growth in the last year. We started this with just 26 practitioners. This came out of I used to be a co-founder of Cloudability and working in the cab there. We kept hearing people say, "Hey, we don't just want to talk about technology. We want to hear about the best practices. We want to talk to each other. We want to understand the discipline." So as we started to scale this out, we realized we needed to really make it a clearly open source, vendor neutral best practices organization. And we just joined the Linux Foundation to do that. And we're seeing some really exciting participation. The beating heart of the organization are our practitioner members. These are the people in end user companies who are actually doing FinOps. We've got about, as of yesterday, we broke 2,000 of those individuals, and they're in there really defining and talking best practices in our Slack in the various areas. And taking advantage of things like the certifications that we offer and contributing to the lexicon. We launched a book last year with O'Reilly called Cloud FinOps, which is really a collection of the stories and best practices from these individuals. Oops. So one of the things that we are announcing today and that we hinted at the Open Source Summit is the addition of new vendor member programs. We've been completely focused on practitioners to date, bringing in that sort of best practice. And we heard from the practitioners two consistent themes over the last year. One was that there's a lot of expertise in the clouds, the cloud management vendors, the consultancies who are out there doing this work. And the practitioners want to ensure that expertise was brought into the fold of what we're doing. But also they wanted to make sure that when they went to work with a vendor, whether it be a cloud, a consultant, or a management vendor, that we were all speaking the same language, that the foundation and the practitioners hadn't thought of one set of best practices and the vendor was using another. So as part of this, we launched 3 programs that we announced at the Open Source Summit in June. The first is the FinOps Training Partner Program. The second is the FinOps Certified Platform Program. And the third is the FinOps Certified Service Provider Program. And each of these programs, following the Cloud Native Computing Foundation and Linux Foundation models, are based on companies joining our foundation and hitting a certain set of criteria to be a part of these. So very excited to announce today the initial 11 vendor member companies who have joined the FinOps Foundation. Big shout out and thank you to our leading premier member, which is Cloud Health by VMware. Very excited to share what these individuals are going to be doing. Just got to note that some questions are rolling in also. We will answer those a little bit later. Also want to give a shout out to Apptio Cloudability, which was the original founding partner and really helped launch this back in 2009 with both funding and in-kind help along the way. And very excited to bring in the additional 9 partners listed here on the screen. Cloud Easier, CloudSoft, CloudWise, lots of clouds, Contino, KubeCost, Neos, Opsani, Prosper Ops, and Tim Spirit. So you're going to learn more about all these on our website as I talk about these programs, and we'll hear from a few of these companies today as part of the content that we are covering. So let's look at each of the individual programs. I think this is the program that we've heard the most from practitioners that they wanted, which was a program that maps capabilities of FinOps against individual service providers. We've built a very nascent set of these capabilities that we're beginning to map providers against. The initial program partners for this are the ones listed here on the screen. We'll be doing a lot of work in the coming months to really grow that list of capabilities along with the members, the practitioners, and the clouds themselves to further define these. But if you look at our website, you can find out in our GitHub more about the capabilities that these companies offer. I am moving fast here because we have a lot of content, so apologies if I don't cover anything that you want to hear. You can drop that in the Q&A. The next one is the FinOps Training Partner Program. We have offered a number of certifications and trainings through the FinOps Foundation. We've heard from practitioners that they want to both be able to get these in their regional areas and get it specialized and focused and customized into services that both platforms and consultancies offer. So this program is very much based around the model of offering training. We offer instructor-led courses that we've been doing now for, I think we've done 15 or 20 of them now in the last few quarters virtually. These are now also going to be offered by the private and custom training partners, the FinOps training partners. as well as the free Intro to FinOps course that's available on edX. And then these certifications, the first one on the right is available now. It's now through the Linux Foundation, the FinOps Certified Practitioner, with additionals coming down the road. So big shout out to the 4 FinOps training partners, Cloudability, Cloud Health, Cloud Easier, and Contino. All of these are now certified to offer these trainings, and then are essentially going to be resellers of the FinOps Certified Practitioner certification, which will, for consistency's sake, still go through the Linux Foundation to ensure that everyone meets the same standards. And the last program is the FinOps Certified Service Provider Program. This one is really geared and focused on companies who provide services around FinOps, whether that be consultancy or advisory services in this area. Really great group of companies here on the screen. A few more, so I won't read them all out, who are providing this. We're excited to see a lot more coming down the road. Again, check out our website and our Slack for more information on these. Most exciting to me, I think, is probably the formation of this new technical advisory council, which is going to be basically working in the open on GitHub to define the capabilities and the curriculums and the open source needs for all these areas. As part of this, excited to announce today that we have added a number of new individuals to this. Mike Fuller, who is the co-author of the book, is going to be the TAC chair from Atlassian. Excited to also add Eugene Kostov, who is from Aptio Cloudability. He was formerly on the AWS Insights team and building out their products. John McLaughlin, who is from Cloud Health VMware. We're going to hear from one of his colleagues later today. Matt Leonard, who is billing product lead for Google Cloud. He formerly did this for AWS and for Microsoft, so great expertise there. And Debo from his team is going to be talking today. Ashley Ramatko, who shared a ton of best practices over the last year in the foundation from Pearson. And Joe Daly from Nationwide, who's also been one of the core contributing members. We will be adding additional folks in the coming months that will be by the charter, which is on GitHub if you want to read it. It's structured really to be a combination of practitioners, general and premier members, and industry appointed people who will really flesh out and build the lexicon of best practices over time. So jumping back after all those announcements, and of course I'm already on overtime, which I told the speakers I wouldn't let them do, to this world where you've got all these services teams looking for money and bypassing procurement. We now get to introduce, for the topic today, what happens in the world of Kubernetes with this happening. And what I wanted to highlight as an intro is that the world of Kubernetes adds layers and layers of virtualization on top of this challenge we had before in cloud, which is trying to figure out what's idle, what resources to remove, trying to figure out what to right size, whether it used to be instances and now you need to do clusters and namespaces and figure out resource utilization for those. It adds complication to this challenge of figuring out what to recommend to teams. What do they spin up, spin down? How do they size their resources? And it makes it much more difficult to start to report out wastage to these teams, right? The areas of, okay, you've said you're going to use this thing. Now, what are you really using? The real challenge here, I think, and as a number of our speakers are going to get to, is around the world of how do we start to take all these differently sized buckets of spend, not buckets in the AWS sense, but buckets in the sense of clusters and labels and namespaces, to figure out how to then allocate those out to individual teams. This is one of the biggest challenges of FinOps, cloud financial management, is getting chargeback accurate so that we can get to that world we talked about, the nirvana of helping teams make better decisions. So with all of that, I'm very excited to introduce our lightning talks today. All these speakers are going to be contributing content to what is going to be an open source white paper that is launching in November at CloudNativeCon on this topic. This is our lineup today. I'll let each of them introduce themselves in the interest of time for this, but a great mix of practitioners, clouds, and cloud management vendors who are going to help us unpack this problem. At the end of this, we are going to do a Q&A. We've had some questions coming in. We'll speak to as many of those as possible. And we have just launched the FinOps swag store. I'm wearing one of the shirts today. It says FinOps on the back here. For everybody who asks a question that we take, that we think is a good question, we'll be giving you a $25 gift card to go buy an awesome FinOps t-shirt or sticker or something like that. So please get your questions ready, and excited to hear from each of our speakers. With that, I am going to stop my screen share and pass to Sasha from LiveRamp.
Great. Thanks very much, JR. And hello to all the conference participants. When I was trying to think of what I wanted to talk about, I tried to put myself in your shoes. And we were there about 2 years ago when we were pursuing a migration from our on-premise data center to GCP. And we decided to containerize at the same time. And so I tried to think back to the kind of challenges that we had and where I looked to for help and resources at that time. And you're going to hear me repeat myself a bit during the conversation. That's only because I want to reinforce all the things we did that you can do to avoid the pain of managing your Kubernetes clusters in the cloud as it relates to the cost of it and perhaps like some of the ancillary management things you'd have to think about. So a bit of context on LiveRamp. I'm the head of global cloud operations for LiveRamp. We are headquartered in San Francisco and have about 1,300 employees. We have over 200 developers, and we transform data for marketing companies for the most part. We help them connect to their customers. And in support of that, we had an on-premise data center in San Francisco. Now, before I get into the details of our environment to set the context so you all understand how we approached our Kubernetes problems, I wanted to take a quick moment to, number one, thank JR for organizing this and for the rest of the speakers on the panel. There are representatives from the CMP space here. It's quite a bit of an art to develop software for developers, and we certainly appreciate all the software that was available to us when we were trying to solve this problem. And then the other thing I would note is that if you are a person on the call who's new to FinOps and you're trying to understand how it can help you solve your problems related to cloud spend and Kube, I would definitely join the FinOps Foundation. It was something that we discovered about 6 months into our migration, and we discovered that someone else had perfectly synthesized and articulated all the points that we were beginning to explore and things that were already brewing in our minds based on the pain that we were experiencing ourselves. And when we joined the foundation and the Slack channel, the Slack group that it has, we discovered conversations that were like incredibly relevant to the problems that we were trying to solve. And we spent literally months going through the conversations and figuring out what we should do as a company ourselves. So if you are in this space and you haven't joined the FinOps Foundation yet, and you haven't joined the Slack group, I would definitely do that immediately. Thank you so much for making it available. So in terms of LiveRamp and our background, I wanted to set the context and help you understand how we arrived at the problems we arrived at. We were migrating from an on-premise data center with about 3,000 Hadoop nodes, about 100 petabytes of data. We had not yet containerized. We were running in VMs, and we were using the VMware vCenter APIs to automate. Most of our traffic was probably about, there were petabytes of data going back and forth every day on behalf of our customers. And we were migrating because we were in a data center in San Francisco. And for those of you who don't know, San Francisco is active earthquake country. We were in a data center that we had joined when we were a fledgling startup, and we didn't have 3,000 Hadoop nodes. We just had 10, and then 50, and then 100, and then 400. And we began to outstrip their capacity as well. We couldn't do DR effectively as well. And so for all those different reasons, we wanted to migrate to the cloud. We also wanted to give our developers the opportunity to deploy infrastructure by API. And we could do that with GCP and AWS and those vendors. And so we embarked on this massive migration. We did planning for about 6 months, and then the execution took about a year. We ran our on-premise data center at the same time that we were migrating to the cloud. Now, when we first deployed Kubernetes, we were using CoreOS on physical hardware in our on-premise data center. And that gave us some tools. There was very little cost visibility that we got natively from doing that. And so we started to think about GKE. And we knew that it would give us an API that would work very consistently. We felt that it was the best-in-class tool, and so we decided that in the cloud we were just going to use GKE rather than deploying CoreOS into the cloud as well. One of the things that happened in the background that we began to understand is a point that JR mentioned earlier, which is that yes, we were giving the developers an API and the control to spin up resources at any time, but really that was also an API to spend money at will. And we kind of understood that, but it really didn't hammer in home until the finance folks arrived at our door and asked us what this new spend that they were seeing was. And so I think it's at that point that we began to actually consider and think about FinOps a bit. So the perceived value that we thought we were getting in the cloud, we certainly got. We had a successful migration, a successful technical migration. And, we sort of declared victory. And about a month after we had completed the migration and all of our workloads were there, the finance folks began to notice that our budget was something like 50% over what it should have been. And that was primarily because we had migrated, but had not yet had the cultural shift in our company and helped our developers understand what their newfound responsibilities were. Now, when we were designing GKE and we were trying to figure out how it should operate within the cloud, should we have one large cluster? Should we have a bunch of small clusters? We were rationalizing our decision in different ways. We were thinking about security first. We were thinking about cost boundaries as well. And with the specter of DevOps in the background, we had given our developers full control over their environments. Our central DevOps team built tooling for other devs to manage their own environments. And so at the time, it made a lot of sense to us that we should have a cluster per team, give them full control to deploy into that, to stand up the cluster themselves, to give them tools to support that, and sort of let them run on their own, because the perception was they wanted to do that. The perception was having that control would allow them to go faster. And we would simply provide tooling and they'd be sort of happy with that. And each cluster was its own cost and security boundaries. This is another interesting point. The kind of tools that existed 2 years ago or 2.5 years ago when we first started using GKE, and the tools that exist today, both from Google and from CMPs, are radically different. And I think they would definitely influence our decision and how we would choose to do things today if we were to do them. And so at the time, 2 years ago, this seemed to make sense, this model of a cluster per team. And so we ended up with something like 100 different clusters. And it worked okay for us. What we discovered was, number one, there was some developers, like let's say we have a front-end development team that really didn't want to know how to stand up their own cluster. They just wanted a target to just drop a container using a pipeline, and then it's off and running. They weren't excited about managing their own environments. And that was a surprise to us, but it seemed to make sense because, you know, if they can spend their time doing some other work that's related to production that delivers more value for the company, there isn't a great reason for them to run and manage their own cluster. So that is one of the things that we'd likely change today, which is I think we'd have a default policy of having a one or two large common clusters, and then an option for a team that wants it to have their own cluster as well. Now, as it relates to cost attribution, there is a challenge there. And I think the challenge can be addressed today with things like namespacing. If you're going to have a large cluster, it's going to be difficult to figure out which containers are associated with which team, and then to find a way to attribute the cost of their resources running directly to that team and to that product as well. But I think today, namespacing within GKE does that. I think that we would probably try to use Cloud Run where possible, and it eliminates, the issue of responsibility, and it makes it easier to attribute cost as well. I think the vendors have come in and provided very interesting tooling that allows you to attribute cost within Kubernetes. I know that Cloudability has something in the space. We have not used Cloud Run, but I'd be curious to know if they've got that going as well. I think using a CMP is probably a good thing. Now, I don't want to advertise on their behalf, but I think it would be very difficult for us to properly attribute cost for GKE, specifically if we were only using the native tooling provided by Google. Now, they do a great job of releasing new APIs every quarter, and the abilities in the central console improve consistently, but there's a superset of features that we find with the CMPs that made it very compelling for us in particular. I think I'd like to hand it off to Debo, but just to summarize some of the recommendations that I would have for those of you in the audience pursuing cost management for your kube clusters. Number one, use the FinOps Foundation Slack group as a means to discover other people's pain that looks a lot similar to the pain that you're about to go through, and learn from it and incorporate that information into your design. I would say read the FinOps book if you get it. It's a great synthesis of all the information that's been in the groups and conversations apparently for the last 5, 6, 7 years. I would definitely consider using the native tooling for if you're a startup, but once you get beyond let's say $50,000 to $100,000 of spend, I would begin to look at some of the tools in this space, in the CMP space. So with that said, I'm going to hand it off to Debo from GCP to continue the talk.
All right. Well, hello to all the attendees, and thanks for joining us in these very unusual but still needing information times. Just wanted to go ahead and make sure that I take the chance to thank Sasha for all the advice given there. And it's a great tee up for me because as a customer and someone who's really looking at this very carefully, I think that there's nothing that can replace experience to go alongside advice. So let me go ahead and share my screen here and get started myself. So if you would give me just a second. All right, I think we're ready to go. So just by way of introduction, my name is Debo. as I mentioned earlier, and I've been a product manager at Google for the last couple of years. My career in terms of the cloud space started at AWS, where I was working at the marketplace, and I really focused there on really helping introduce people to software that allowed them to utilize cloud infrastructure in the best ways to do other functions like manage firewalls, deal with cloud application development controllers, and other things like that. And I kind of transitioned into Google to look at the scope of how people are dealing with cost management and all the elements that go along with it. So that includes metering and telemetry. It includes looking at their data as it flows through not just billing systems, but commerce systems, usage systems that we control here at Google. And then, of course, where I am now in cost management. So I work with Matt Leonard, who's a member of the FinOps Foundation, a core group of members to help here as a team lead. And I really focus on making sure that customers can understand their costs as respective containers of value for their workloads. So when we think about GCP as a vendor in this space, we really think about GKE and Google Cloud Platform. So as you can see here, we've done a lot of work to make sure that we really have a dashboard that allows people to really control things, but not necessarily have to dive super deep into the world of compute in order to manage things. It's really to flexibly define resources that are scalable with your application, right? So we've heard a lot of reasons that folks love to roll with GKE. The idea that it's native, that you've got Kubernetes and GKE really working together so that upgrading your nodes, and by that we mean your clusters and all the things that come with them, is easy. We get those releases well. We have GKE and Docker working well together, so GKEs can schedule those containers based on the requirements and configurations that you manage, which is a nice way to be able to do it, especially if you're familiar with Docker and containerization. Networking is a lot easier because you're managing your network scaling and connections at various granularities, whether it's the pod, the cluster, the node, and it's all managed in a single place. So you're dealing with auto scaling and automatic node creation or deletion based on whether or not the master sees that the policy is going to be correct, right? And all that drives towards price. As long as you're flexibly able to define your pay-as-you-go structure, or because really it's managed compute, and you're dealing with committed use discounts, there's a lot of different ways for you to get, when you know your stable usage, discounts on what you're actually trying to deal with in terms of your compute, storage, and other needs. So we've heard that a lot of folks are very happy and are continuing to dive deep into using GKE because of all these reasons. But you're not just here to learn about GKE and why people use it. You're learning about, okay, so I'm using GKE, or I'm using in any cloud really, the managed version of compute, such that I can spend a little bit more time focusing on my containerization and applications and less time focusing on the nuts and bolts of exactly what VM I need to schedule which workload, right? And when people come to talk to us about that, they end up talking about a lot of different elements in terms of financial governance and operations, which is, hey, we've got a financial plan. We want to make sure that we stick within a certain amount of spend, or we want to make sure that our spend scales appropriately with our workloads. We want to be able to monitor it and avoid surprises, because even though we may have different types of hierarchies that we organize our workloads in, we want to monitor them all to make sure that they're giving us enough feedback to make decisions. We want to think about scaling so that we can meet the demand of our customers in turn, even as we serve as a customer for Google. And we want to make sure that we scale in ways that make sense, right? So depending on how we set up our infrastructure and how we set up our flexible organizations within our organization, so whatever teams might be using Kubernetes, we want to make sure that they have the ability to make scaling decisions at their levels, as well as the larger level for the whole group. And then restricting usage and costs where it does not generate value, or just learning that I can shut things down and not have to really think about it in terms of the micromanagement of your compute, storage, and other resources. So it's pretty interesting when we talk to many of our customers in terms of what is most important to them when it comes to dealing with the resources and infrastructure they use in us. As you can see here, folks really are very budget conscious, and they understand that they get a lot of flexibility and they abstract things one layer away, but they still care about how they're managing their costs for infrastructure, especially when you're coming from a data center where costs were more fixed and a little bit more predictable, in terms of moving into the cloud and continuing going forward. And then beyond that, it's ideas for cost savings continually as you get better and more mature at managing your spend, forecasting more spend, and limiting surprises, just as I mentioned before in the previous slide. Beyond that, trust between IT and finance, project level spend, and even in containers other than just project, but maybe the flexible ways that you want to define how your infrastructure looks. You want to be able to make sure that you can communicate those costs to the various stakeholder groups, right? So all that scales into predictability. Everybody really wants to know, how do I make my costs predictable? So when we look at it from a Google Cloud cost management perspective, we have 4 pillars that we really think about in terms of supporting financial operations and making costs visible and accessible to the right people. So that's visibility, the idea of built-in reports, custom dashboards, the BigQuery billing export that we have on our side that allows you to export all of your data in a streaming manner to make sure that your costs are available to you and you can do a lot of analysis, whether it's custom or just a simple analysis that we find very common for all of our customers. It's accountability. So that's thinking about the idea that you have flexible ways to organize your resources and allocate and attribute your costs so you can do chargeback, which is the ability to say, hey, look, DevOps, we want to make sure that you've spent this much and this is what you're responsible for. Maybe that is or is not over your budget. And that might be true for several other groups within your organization as well, or just showing them, what they're spending and showing them the variance and the change in the spend. You've got control, which is really just controlling for overspending, reducing the runaway costs that might come from maybe having a little bit of neglect from one part of your infrastructure versus being alerted, being able to have programmatic controls once you realize there is some kind of aberration so that you can deal with that appropriately. And finally, intelligence. The ability for Google Cloud specifically to be an advisor to you and say, hey, maybe you might want to do some right sizing or auto scaling or thinking about different types of cost optimizations that you can have so that you can get a discount on your stable usage. We want to make sure that you are optimizing your cloud bill more often than not. So, it's helpful to think about this in terms of a few examples, and Sasha just gave one, which is really helpful for us. But we've been hearing a lot of things as customers move because there's a lot of different areas of maturity that they have in terms of their cloud journey. So we've heard from customers who are saying, hey, we're moving from data centers directly into more of a Kubernetes type of scaling or a GKE type of scaling so that we can focus on having apps and containerization define our infrastructure usage. We have folks who are coming from compute engine. We're saying, hey, I manage my VMs. I've now got thousands of them. That's kind of a pain. How can I cluster them so they more better align to our applications that we need to define? And so the first idea here that we talk about in terms of those customers is that they may move from many projects or other definitions of their workloads to application defined workloads. So they want to say, instead of having 1,000 projects, say, hey, many of these customers are contributing to a single application, whether it's the front end or the back end of it. And we want to define our infrastructure by that application instead. And so we're moving to Kubernetes so we can actually use that as a way of defining and deploying those workloads. And then another example is, dealing with the idea of having those clusters and those workloads defined, but having named teams to namespaces. So the ability to flexibly define a namespace that's going to be a cost container. You'll be charging internally or keeping track and monitoring your costs according to that namespace. And therefore, those namespaces have different things deployed in them for the dedicated functions that part of a cluster or pod or node may define. And then labeling, right? We find that a lot of people are using Kubernetes labels to help define what a workload may be used for. And their hope is that by having those Kubernetes labels available, they can, again, look at the costs across those labels so that if there's an application that's spanning across clusters in terms of utility, or there's a team that spans across many clusters, they can use that Kubernetes label to organize them, right? But in all of these strategies, they want to make sure they understand what their cost drivers are, because all the costs are divided in many ways across the workload. So let's kind of take a look into that. really, when we think about workloads, it's kind of a matrix in terms of how the business and developers work together to see things. You've got the vertical structures of all the pieces of infrastructure that people are using, like cores, memory, persistent disk, network egress, different ways to manage this workload, including Cloud Run, Anthos, Dataproc, some of these other tools that are going to work alongside the infrastructure and the applications that you're making. And then you overlay the workload definitions on top of those. So that might be at the granularity of a pod, or it might be granularity of an application or a project. And the idea is that you don't want to have to think about the cost containers in terms of just one or the other, because yes, Google Cloud charges for the cores used, the memory, disks, and all that. But if it's much more helpful for you to think about your costs in terms of your application, then you want to be able to include a little bit of each of those infrastructure departments in a total cost of ownership for your workload. So that's really what we're trying to drive to and help to make sure that you can understand and manage your costs the same way that you manage your workloads. So just driving in a little deeper, what does that mean? It means that we've got all these different types of containers on the left, right? You see the billing hierarchy, org folder project. You've got resources, as I've mentioned just on the previous slide. You've got your namespaces, which could be default or development or whatever namespace is appropriate for you, and your labels, right? Which can include everything from team and department to version number, subcomponents, your sub-customers, the customers who are working to you, to do all the things on the right. Everything from invoicing and dealing with audits to cost allocation, answering questions and doing analysis, forecasts, budgets and variation, optimization, quotas and caps, knowing when to stop these things, right? So this is the general space that we're dealing with in terms of managing costs the same way you deal with your workloads in the Kubernetes world for us. So the types of questions that we tend to see tend to be more of, how do I deal with costs versus utilization, right? So if you're actually spending based on the requests that Kubernetes is making for your behalf, how do you deal with the utilization there? And Kubernetes, the GKE team is really working to help deal with recommendations there. How can I focus on forecasts and budgets? How can I present these costs and do accountability for chargeback and showback? How can I manage Kubernetes as a platform across multiple clouds? And even Sasha talked a little bit about shared resources, right? One thing that we find particularly interesting is that folks are looking for ways to manage network egress, which may not necessarily be proportionally something that you want to allocate. Maybe you want to actually show the true direction of what areas of your clusters are using more network egress than others, and the same with storage, right? Optimizing cluster management and going with lots of small clusters or a few large clusters. And in Sasha's example, you get the few large clusters, but we also heard teams that say, hey, we are really, really experienced with Kubernetes and we want to do a lot of clusters as well. So I guess the big thing that I want to say here is there's a lot of questions that we see here. There's a lot of things that we want to answer, but we're really driving towards a new experience. And this is something that we're continually and iteratively working on to help you think about monetization flexibly moving across your workloads, right? So, I don't want to go too much into detail just for the sake of time, but you can see on the right, the user experiences of reporting, budgets and alerts, billing export are really going to help with that. And, we're really driving to give people tools like GKE usage metering, which allows you to flexibly manage by namespace and label, and Anthos cost management. So Anthos doing multi-cloud management and billing native GKE and Anthos features. So that's just kind of the tip of the iceberg there. We understand a lot of the things that you want to do in this space. And I want to make sure that Casey gets a chance, of course, in this wrapping to talk a little bit about how they see it. But, I'm happy to answer any questions and give lots of materials in terms of dealing with cloud management and cost management from a GKE and GCP perspective. So let me hand that over to Casey, and thanks so much for listening.
Great. Thanks, Debo. Let me just quick grab the screen here. Make sure that's all working. Okay, fantastic. So thanks, Debo, for that. And it's actually great, to see some of the progress that you all are making with usage metering. Love to see that. So first, before I dive in, I really want to thank, JR and the FinOps Foundation, for inviting us to be part of this and this amazing group, as well as the CNCF, and everyone that's kind of joining and listening in. Look forward to some of the Q&A afterwards. For those of you that I have not met, my name is Casey Doran. I've worked on Cloudability, as well as now part of Aptio for the last 3 years. Oh, can you not see my screen? I'm hearing that maybe you can't see my screen. Let me stop and try it again. Are we seeing it now? Okay, great. Thanks for that. So, one thing that we've been working on quite a bit at Cloudability for the last few years is really digging into the challenges that everybody's been illustrating regarding cost allocation, as well as optimization in a Kubernetes world. So I'm going to spend the next, 7 or 8 minutes, digging into some of those challenges, some best practices around solving those challenges, and how you can use some of those to overcome the same problem in your organization. So let me just dive right into that. And I want to start through a customer story. So, in kind of early to mid 2017, we had a lot of customers that started to come to us with questions around this. So one in particular, large, technology company utilizing multiple clouds through a variety of acquisitions, and they were working on transitioning to Kubernetes. A lot of great reasons to do that, but very quickly they encountered a cost allocation problem, and this was critical to them and their organization to be able to do complete chargeback. So what are some of those challenges, right? So immediately you start to lose visibility into consumption of these shared clusters, that everybody's using the same cluster. There's really a need to allocate that usage to the correct cost centers. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the best ways to do that. And the reality here is it's not just one or the other, right? Every team, that's using Kubernetes is likely to have some Kubernetes cost, but some non-Kubernetes cost. And you're really going to want to look at that all together. So what are some best practices to help with these issues? So the first thing, you're going to want to collect that utilization data. Debo talked about namespaces. That's going to be critical to start pulling that data and associating with the cloud billing data. You're also going to want to label your Kubernetes resources to align with those cost centers, whether that's application, team, business unit, et cetera. And then you're going to want to unify that with the more traditional resource tag keys. So you're doing that in a unified way that's going to give you that ability to allocate holistically. So with that, you're going to be able to allocate the costs, based on those Kubernetes constructs. You're going to be able to analyze by those, critical cost centers that you need to do chargeback for. And then in the end, you're going to be able to perform full allocation, across Kubernetes and non-Kubernetes workloads, and provide those teams the insights they need to perform better. So let's dig a little bit deeper into some of those challenges. So obviously, somewhat oversimplified picture here, but here's kind of the traditional way that we used to do this and have done this for years. Teams tended to have dedicated resources. In this case, we're looking at 3 different apps, multiple services across different cloud providers, but relatively straightforward in terms of allocation. We can use tags, tag key value pairs, and then you look in the billing data, analyze that, go ahead, and there's your allocation. In the Kubernetes world, this breaks down, right? So, those vendor tags are not enough. We're sharing clusters, the same set of VMs that we looked at on the previous screen, but they're shared. There's no way to just use a specific tag, and on top of that, there's going to be, and JR talked about this at the beginning, there's going to be some waste, some idle resources, and we're also going to want to understand how we can allocate that back to the right place. But it's actually more complex than that, right? The reality is it's both, right? We're going to have both situations. This Navy app, for example, they're running some things on Kubernetes, but they've also got some compute over on GCP, and they're using some BigQuery that's dedicated to them. So again, the need to unify into a single model for complete allocation. So let's talk about how we can help with this. So the first thing is we talked about collecting utilization data, right? So pulling this utilization data from the underlying cluster resources, so memory, CPU, network, et cetera, by container object types, namespace, deployment, daemon set, whatever is important for you, to allocate by, as well as those label key value pairs. Then you want to associate that utilization data with the underlying cluster cost for that allocation. And one just shameless plug, we do have an open source metrics agent that helps with this collection. So this is something that you can, grab, utilize yourself, and then go ahead and pull this data. The next thing is that labeling strategy. So Debo got into this a little bit, so think about what's important for you to perform allocation by. Is that app? Is it team? Is it department? You want to then align that across the different cloud providers. If you've got Kubernetes clusters in multiple clouds, make sure that you're doing that in the same way. And if possible, automate that. So as your developers are rolling things out, you're assuring that tagging is going out with that deployment, and it's not happening after the fact. And then lastly, and we talked about this a little bit, that unified model for tags and labels. So you can see, in the screenshot, we're unifying the keys across team, environment, as well as application, so we can look at those data together in a single model. So now that we've done that, how does it come together, right? So the first thing, you're able to visualize your Kubernetes costs across cluster, namespace, and label. And you can see in this case, you're breaking down maybe what originally was a single line item for EC2 by the specific usage of that by that specific namespace and team. You're also able to visualize your Kubernetes and non-Kubernetes costs together, right? So in this case, we're looking at a squad. This squad has some Kubernetes, non-Kubernetes are using some, some EC2, some CloudWatch, but also have some things running in Kubernetes clusters. We're looking at this all in a single dashboard, and giving the ability to do that in one location based on having pulled this data. And then lastly, this customer was able to pull all this data together, and create single dashboards. So then they, across all these different constructs, all these costs are accounted for. One thing that was incredibly critical, to this customer as well was accuracy, right? So we've talked a little bit about this, before, but in terms of the utilization data, you also want to pull this request information, right? So if somebody has a request that's consistently over their actual usage, that's what you want to use to allocate, because no one else is able to use those resources. You also want to factor in things like node pinning. All workloads may not be running, on all nodes within the cluster. So that's also critical, to make sure that you're bringing in, and also, true costs here, right? So not necessarily list price from the cloud providers, but maybe you've got some RIs or committed use discounts running on these resources. You want to look at all of that and factor that in, so you make sure your teams are actually looking at the accurate costs. And then the last thing that I would say before handing it over to Jonathan would be reporting on idle. And so making sure you're looking at the idle resources in the cluster, providing that to your teams. This was critical, to this organization that I'm talking about, and bring that to the teams to give them the data they need to optimize those clusters. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much, and I'd like to then hand over to Jonathan to continue the talk. Thanks a lot.
Great, thanks, Casey. Some all sorts of awesome content here. We have more to come, so I'm going to continue the theme of trying to be concise and keep things on time. I will also start with a quick thank you to KubeCon, to the FinOps Foundation and JR, not for only putting the FinOps Foundation together, but kicking off this discussion here and inviting Cloud Health to participate, as well as this fantastic panel. This really is a topic that I think we've seen be more and more relevant as organizations not only evolve their FinOps practices, but evolve their applications in parallel. And I feel like those two things have gained particular traction over the past like couple of years, kind of in parallel, which is interesting. And Cloud Health has been. I'm not going to talk too much about Cloud Health. I'm going to kind of take a lens of a lot of the stuff that JR, Sasha, Debo, Casey talked about around how do you like allocate shared resources. But just in our experience, Cloud Health has been doing the kind of this modern app lens of FinOps for the past few years. Just trying to take some of that experience into some key questions we find useful to ask yourself. So with that, I'm going to just share a couple slides that may be useful for that, dive right in, and then we'll take it from there. Let me see if I can share my screen. Okay, great. So maybe just a quick intro for myself. I'm a product manager on the Cloud Health team at VMware. I've been there for about a year. Before that, I was actually working on networking and security for modern apps in Kubernetes on the NSX and search side of the house. This is kind of a basic framework that Cloud Health uses just to help facilitate conversations. And one of the things I'm looking forward to at the FinOps, being part of the FinOps organization, is just, like JR said, finding that common language. Maybe parts of this evolve, but what we found helpful is just this kind of natural evolution of this reporting, this cost allocation. How do I get that clear visibility? What are my costs, my team's costs versus your team's costs when I look at that highly complex cloud bill? And then from there, how do I optimize? What are my optimizations versus your optimizations, so on and so forth? How do I do that on a regular basis through ongoing governance and automation? And how does that kind of plug into all my business systems? So, eventually maybe it becomes autonomous. But digging straight into the kind of Kubernetes lens, again, kind of 5 key questions I like to highlight. Some of these we've covered, but I'm going to kind of also paint the lens of the different disparate teams that we work with here. So nothing's cookie cutter here. No two orgs look the same. In particular, I think some of these lessons come from just the differences and the challenges, as well as the commonalities between a startup that's cloud first, started with Kubernetes, all your apps are modernized, and the kinds of challenges you see there, versus a really, let's say a 50,000 person, 10,000 person enterprise that is part of their, like Casey said, they got a really mixed environment, some modern apps, some more legacy apps. How do we do this all together? But across the board, it's just the first question is what do you want? What do you want to report on? So we learned in the recent talks about all the options we have to report on them, but what do you actually care about, right? So I think what we've seen is, teams, app teams, especially on the startup side, they're often the ones to start to just wear a lot of hats, dig into the FinOps side of it and say, great, I've got this tool set now. I can divvy up my costs. I'm going to go straight to this. I like JR said, bucket. I actually used bucket icons. Coincidentally, go into like a microservice cost bucket, which is very granular, right? Or for a lot of organizations can be very granular. But the reason why this top line question is important is what matters to the rest of the business? Because then often we'll see the finance side of the house saying, well, all I really care at the end of the day is how much did this product line cost me? Maybe you're a small organization, you're really just focusing on your first product. Maybe you're a much larger organization, you've got a number of products, and really how does that align? You can get started without answering this across the entire organization, but it's going to be a question that's going to keep coming back. Like, what is the language you use within the organization? What are those buckets? How do those buckets align? And then that gets to the question of like, oh, okay, well, what metadata are we using for those buckets? I'm diving straight to the Kubernetes example. Like Casey said, for a lot of organizations, it's not just Kubernetes. It's, okay, how does this align with my tags? But given our KubeCon, zooming into the Kubernetes side, even in small teams, but especially in larger enterprises, you quickly see even just what a cluster means. It's easy. At KubeCon here, there's a lot of talks about great best practices, but it's very easy in Kubernetes, which is so flexible and gives you so many choices to quickly just use each of these constructs in different ways. So kind of just painted the picture here because we see this over and over again. It's like, well, this team kind of uses clusters in that way. This team uses clusters in that way. I think more commonly namespace differences and one team using namespace across the team, or other teams using namespace to signify like a microservice or my app-centric construct. confusion around, oh, well, everybody uses this app label. We've aligned, great. But what does app actually mean? Is it a microservice? Is it the whole application? And then, of course, just the general, what are all the other labels you use? What are some of the, maybe you want like multiple buckets from the last question. What are those buckets? Casey touched on this. This is another interesting question when we talk about, okay, specific to the Kubernetes side, we're now also talking about shared resources. Let's just take the compute of my worker nodes. That's often one of the biggest costs generated by Kubernetes. I'm scaling up a big application. Got lots of worker nodes, lots of instances, VMs, whatever they are. Costing me a lot of money. How do I share that? I've got a pod from one team on the same worker node as a pod, but also on the same node as a pod from another team. How do I divvy that up? And there's this is maybe oversimplifying it, but in my, I think the whole theme here is to kind of take this very complex landscape and ask some very simple questions to help guide us. And here I think the common trade-offs we see are resource requests versus actual usage, right? So I can see what did my workloads, my team's workloads ask of Kubernetes that then got spun up. And because they got spun up, they accumulated cost. Somebody's got to pay for that cost. For that reason, we see a lot of organizations moving or using resource requests as that common metric. But the flip side is, well, what if I asked for, my app asked for X and Y amount of resources, but it didn't use them? That's not fair. I want to only get charged for what I used. But there's kind of pros and cons to each side here that I think are worth considering, so you can make the right choice for you. For example, what kind of incentives do you want to create across the development teams, or whoever it is that's setting that YAML or those Terraform templates or whatever it is that's configuring your resource requests? And by the way, there's tools out there to help you, like a vertical pod autoscaler, which is open source, which can help you say, hey, this pod keeps asking for 4 CPUs, but it really only ends up using a quarter of one. So, hey, maybe next time you want to not ask Kubernetes for so many resources, they're costing us a lot of money, and align your requests to what you actually end up using. That's kind of the nirvana state, but you're never in that perfect zone. So what are the incentives you want to set up? And I think, we see folks thinking about that as they choose which metric to use here. How are we doing on time? Just a few more minutes here. Just to wrap up the thought, we'll pass over to Webb from KubeCost. Question 4, who pays for the common services? Now, in some environments, this is kind of inconsequential or seems really small, but similar to that question, which actually was covered by the left side of the idle time, who pays for that idle CPU time? There's also who pays for something like a service mesh. We just rolled out Istio. Overhead's pretty small, but it still costs some infrastructure to have a sidecar container for every sidecar pod for every pod. How do we pay that? How do we pay for that? Is there like a central kind of infrastructure, a cost center? It's kind of the maybe more traditional way of doing IT way of doing things. Some folks still do that in some ways. That's fine. Or is it more to the whole point of the FinOps side? How do we share and kind of allocate dynamically some fair dynamic allocation of some of these costs? And I call this out as a question because different teams will have different answers. And finally, this is kind of a broader topic than a straightforward question, is what are my optimization opportunities? I think the good news is Kubernetes is very flexible. The bad news is, or the challenge side of that is, there's a lot of opportunities for waste. I mentioned the pod scaling or pod sizing challenge. There's also how you're auto scaling your nodes and your pods. I think there's plenty of talks at KubeCon over the past years talking about best practices of operating the platform, operating the infrastructure, auto scaling. There's node right sizing or using the right node for your application. And then there's kind of the discount side of the cloud, which is a little bit more finance centric. Traditionally has also had to do with the infrastructure. If you look at like reserved instances, well, let's take this node right sizing example. If my nodes use M5 workloads in the past, had to, and still in many cases, then I've got to go buy M5XL reserved instances. You see the industry, at least AWS, starting to dip their toe, and to some extent Google committed use discounts, saying let's actually decouple the commitments and discount terms from the infrastructure and just say, look, your infrastructure is going to change as long as you commit to my cloud environment. In most cases here, I'll give you a discount. And those, because that's often a finance-centric conversation that's very relevant for FinOps, but maybe isn't always coming up at KubeCon, I thought I'd kind of build a quick summary of some of the options out there in the industry. This is far from a perfect table. It's just kind of to start the discussion, kind of summarize those resources. With that, wish you all well on your cloud maturity journeys, and I will pass it over to Webb.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Jonathan. And thanks to everybody for joining today. Thanks to all of our organizers, JR and others that help make this possible. I'm going to take some time to take a step back and talk about really the major challenges that we see when teams do this major migration to Kubernetes, and then some of the practical ways that we've seen teams navigate those challenges. So with that, I'll go ahead and kick off a screen share. So like Jonathan mentioned, my name is Webb Brown. I'm co-founder and CEO of KubeCon. Really quickly, a little bit about us. Myself and my co-founder previously built infrastructure monitoring solutions at Google. We worked on external cloud services as well as internal container-based infrastructure. And for the last 2 years, while running KubeCon, we've been exclusively focused on cost, visibility, and optimization solutions for Kubernetes-centric infrastructure. So we provide visibility and help teams with non-Kubernetes cost, but a lot of our users do have a meaningful Kubernetes footprint that is oftentimes growing very quickly. Our company's based in San Francisco, and we have a distributed engineering team. And we have over 1,000 of active deployments of KubeCon across all the major cloud providers, as well as on-prem, even air-gapped environments. These are all different shapes and sizes of, clusters with or environments with up to 10,000 nodes down to really small environments across all different industries. So we feel like we've seen a lot and able to learn a lot of best practices during that time. So our fundamental belief is that with the adoption and migration to Kubernetes, pretty much everything changes with the actual application of FinOps. If you haven't read JR's book, it's actually incredible. It does an amazing job of kind of underlying or like giving a lot of detail around the underlying FinOps lifecycle around inform, optimize, and operate. And while that life cycle isn't fundamentally changing, the knobs that you turn, the technical implementation of recommendations, optimizations, et cetera, is rapidly changing. And we see that in really three major areas. The first is around just new platform extractions, features, and tools. For example, we've talked a little bit about just the new complexity that the orchestration layer as well as containers adds on top of traditional VMs. With this, you're more likely to have multi-tenant or shared resources, and you're actually more likely to have really dynamic environments. So real-time or close to real-time information becomes a lot more important. Secondly, if we just look at why teams move to Kubernetes in the first place, it's really about developer empowerment, right? It's about enabling portability and enabling higher velocity, more transparency, et cetera. And what we see is that these cloud management decisions are not excluded. It's really about helping developers make the best decision for the broader team organization. And that's about letting them have a decentralized decision-making process without overwhelming them. And then third is we have this rapidly evolving open source ecosystem around Kubernetes. So outline a couple of solutions like Helm and Prometheus and service meshes like Linkerd. And what you see is that every part of the application lifecycle is changing. How applications are delivered, how they're observed, how they're managed on an ongoing basis from a security perspective, networking perspective, et cetera. And that obviously has major changes in terms of how you actually manage spend effectively in these new environments. So with that, I'm going to walk through kind of how we see teams actually navigate this. And the first is around embracing the right platform features and tools for your organization and where you are in your Kubernetes journey. Like Jonathan and a couple of others have already mentioned here, is that context really matters. What you'll see in the early days of Kubernetes is that there's tons of options for your team to manage this complexity. Here are just a couple, from emission controllers to taints, to different levels of auto scaling, pod disruption budgets, stateful set, you name it. It's a really long list. And what we've seen just over and over again is that, again, context really matters. One example that I give that we see regularly is this notion of establishing ownership, whether that's as an individual developer, as a team, etc. What we see oftentimes is as a really small team that's just starting with Kubernetes, it may be okay to not have owners, right? The team's small enough to know who owns this cluster or even this namespace, et cetera. But then as that grows, you may rely more and more on, say, namespace annotations or namespace labels. And then as that grows, you may need to get more granular because teams and departments and project sizes are growing. You may move to, say, controller level annotations. And then finally, you may work your way all the way up to emission controllers, which is kind of like a gatekeeper for individual workloads that will enforce or require an owner, whether it be a team or a project lead, et cetera. So I think that's just one example where we see oftentimes the solution depends on, again, your organization and where you are in this journey. So second, again, about really empowering engineers to make great decisions in this area. And it starts by kind of understanding, the day-to-day here. And it's that as developers, we're constantly overwhelmed. We've got 100 things going on at once. So really being super targeted with both the requirements as well as the recommendations and insights that you are delivering to developers. And secondly, to really enable developers, we've seen that by bringing data to workflows and tools that they already use in their day-to-day, can make this a lot easier for them to make great decisions here. One example is using our metrics or other metrics to be writing Grafana, right? Teams regularly are looking at utilization data and other data in some workflow that they're already leveraging, and that could be Grafana or something else. So trying to pipe cost, as JR mentioned, as a first-class citizen right next to that existing data. And then third is, again, really about embracing this growing and oftentimes transparent ecosystem. A lot of this around the CNCF, just see tons of new opportunities for teams to have more control and more focus on just privacy, security, flexibility, et cetera. And ultimately, this is about again, giving developers the right tools at the right time to manage spend effectively. One example is seeing teams leverage open source solutions like Prometheus and Alert Manager to streamline their process for seeing and then acting on real-time cost data through budget alerts, et cetera. So we've seen a lot of teams just be really successful by deeply integrating into kind of the growing open source ecosystem here. We've actually taken a very similar approach with our product. All of our product is built on open source, open core tooling, and just see that as a great opportunity for this ecosystem to have more transparency and more control as time goes on. So in summary here, really quickly, we do think that Kubernetes brings a lot of new complexity, but we also think that the tools and frameworks to manage this complexity are arriving as well. And we're incredibly optimistic about it as a platform and a broader community and ecosystem. in terms of ultimately driving costs down while also giving all these great benefits like faster delivery, portability, et cetera, et cetera. So please reach out if you want to learn more. Happy to help any way we can. We love talking about this stuff. So thank you again. I'll turn it over to JR now for Q&A.
Fantastic. Thank you, everybody. It was great to see very similar talk tracks through this, even though we didn't all see each other's slides ahead of time. So clearly all focusing on the right areas in the space. So we're going to do about 10 minutes of Q&A now. And I've taken a few questions that have come in. If you want to post more in the chat, please do that. And we'll kind of go through these. And feel free, speakers, I'm going to pass one to each of you, but then, others, if you want to join in, let me know. So let's start with Sasha. Sasha, you came up in sort of a DevOps engineering-centric world and have only sort of more recently, sort of in the last year or two, gotten into this financial side of things. Can you speak a little bit? We had a question come up, which was, how FinOps is related to DevOps and DevSecOps. Can you speak a bit to, how those two have intersected for you and why this practice resonated for you as you got into it?
Yeah. Thanks for sending the question my way. So just for some context, I've been active in the Agile space for, at least a decade now. And when I first heard of FinOps, I was at the conference in Las Vegas in Mike Fuller's class, actually. And when he was describing FinOps, I kept making this internal connection in my head to concepts and principles from Agile and from DevOps. And where I saw it intersect very clearly for me was on the concept of responsibility and control and bringing together teams. So for those of you who are, the two people who haven't heard of DevOps on the call, just to reiterate, the principles there are that, it's a collaborative culture made up of different teams that come together to deliver the product. The problems that we were trying to solve with DevOps were around speed of delivery, and we previously would have two separate teams that would be responsible for getting code into production. You would have an operations team and a development team, and then sometimes a QA team as well. And they would send the product in production serially. And they all had different kinds of responsibilities. And at some companies, you had different teams reporting to different VPs who were all responsible for this. Now, the problem was that when there were issues, they would all point fingers at each other. And developers couldn't have access to production either to solve things quickly. By collapsing everyone onto the same team, by recognizing that it's collaboration and that we needed to give developers more responsibility for their product, we were able to solve that problem. And so FinOps is collaborative by default. It's bringing together finance, procurement, and engineering into a conversation where they're all needed to actually make the right decision. And it gives developers that degree of control that they always wanted. They have a cloud API and they can deploy at will. But along with that is the corresponding responsibility of managing your spend and being aware that cost is a dimension of your application's responsibility. So that's sort of how I see the two intersecting and combining. For me, they are simply extensions of the Agile concepts.
Yeah, fantastic. I found that when we were writing the intros to FinOps in the book, I kept finding quotes from the Agile Manifesto and those areas that were just resonating so much. It was really, really cool to see all those intersection points. And that's very much the ethos of it. Awesome. So next question, I'm going to pass this one to Webb. And there have been a few questions around this area of allocating costs within Kubernetes. People have asked, what's the best way to map cost to an app team or a shared cluster? What do you map to? Maybe just summarize that as what do you see as the most common mistakes maybe that people make when trying to figure out that allocation strategy? Where do they start? Where should they be looking in the beginning?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it really hits on everything we've talked about today, right? There is lots of new complexity here, and oftentimes it's non-trivial to navigate and manage. I think if I could summarize, I think the biggest mistake or challenge we make is teams kind of not taking the time to disseminate the why, the and really think through as a broader team the why, and that can be, why are we allocating shared resources the way we are, or why are we allocating idle costs the way we are, and why are we billing on the maximum of requests and usage and not just usage. So I think taking the time and having a process and a set of tools to clearly communicate that allocation kind of reasoning throughout the organization leads to much better adoption, buy-in, and ultimately, accountability and optimization.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's always the hardest challenge, I think, of any FinOps process, is getting that allocation strategy right, because without it, you don't actually have accountability. People say, that's not my resource. Awesome. So I'll pass this one to Casey. I've been collecting, trying to merge questions, 3 or 4 around the aspect of optimization. Sort of, we've been talking inside the containers, but what about outside of them, right? So of the resources, of reservations or savings plans, scaling of those. Can you speak a little bit to the aspect of how you start to think about optimizing the infrastructure and the associated programs in relation to Kubernetes?
Yeah, so, and thanks for that. I think and Webb got at some of these as well. So I think I generally think about this in maybe 3 different fronts here, right? So we've got the concept of cluster right sizing. So, the underlying nodes, are they the right size? Do we have the right amount of them? There's some help you can get with the autoscalers, in terms of that. We also, Webb mentioned this as well, the concept of request over usage, right? And believe it or not, it's still, using Kubernetes, we still see a lot of over provisioning, at least in the data that we see, right? So kind of tracking that, request over usage, if it's consistent, over a period of time, there's clearly some changes you can make. And while there may not be some, immediate cost savings, maybe that just increases the idle bucket, right? It, then gives you an opportunity to further scale those underlying resources, right? And then the last one, which you touched on, JR, but is that what I would call financial optimization. So each cloud provider, whether it's RIs, savings plans, community use discounts, gives you instruments, to save. Probably the most, opportunity that you have to save is there. So doing good financial planning, and looking at historical usage and understanding where you want to make those commitments, is really critical to getting the optimal, I would say, cost that you can get for any workload that you're running, whether it's Kubernetes or not.
It introduces an interesting set of optimization challenges within optimization challenges. It's a little bit of an inception happening when you start to factor in all those things. Cool. So, Jonathan, let's do one for you. You all sort of touched a bit on this, and it's come up in a few different variations in the questions of the strategy for dealing with unallocated and idle or wasted costs. What have you seen been, whether it's splitting it evenly or based on usage or absorbed by a central team? What have you seen sort of been either the most popular or common ones, or the conversations that need to happen in order to decide what to do with those costs?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, I think, just product management hat, when we were doing this discovery with customers a few years ago, and has kind of persisted, the resource, I talked about this a little bit, the resource request proportion model became very attractive because it kind of automatically takes care of this problem. Doesn't have but it has other caveats, right? So if teams kind of like squeeze in workloads without resource requests, well, that also has to be managed. There's some tools in Kubernetes. I mean, you can have like default resource requests, which really help with that. But we've actually seen this as a customer preferred, organization preferred model to just incentivize the right operations of Kubernetes and how teams all plug into Kubernetes. That said, I do see this evolving now, and folks saying, well, maybe we want to in this other app, in this environment, I still get all that logic and all those trade-offs. Nevertheless, I want to just split and see exactly what this app costs based on exactly how much resources it used. And I think, there continue to be ongoing questions. Well, what about the rest of the stuff? Maybe it just goes to the BU, right? It's not that team, but it's not like central either. It's like maybe some like interim, like mid-tier group, if that makes sense, So it's not like my product team that works on it, but it's also not a central IT team for the whole company. It's like whatever BU or org your team reports into. I've seen that maybe become attractive for that. So it still has some business context carried with those idle resources, but not penalizing the individuals.
Yeah, excellent. It sounds like most things in FinOps and related things, there's not one right answer. It depends on the organization. We have one more question, and then we'll wrap right up on time. There was a question around open source tooling for this work, for enforcing governance and tagging. One of the systems we looked at in the foundation, did a presentation on, was Cloud Custodian. Sasha or anyone else, can you share some context or anything you've seen out there around the type of tooling?
Yeah, I mean, I would give it up to Webb, and like we love using his tool. I would also suggest that you can take a look at LiveRamp's open source tooling as well. We open source KDT, which allows you to parameterize your kube cluster settings. We've released that into the wild as well. And then there is a FinOps for Engineers channel in the FinOps Foundation Slack group as well. So that is a great place to learn about what's available for developers.
Excellent. And unless the engineers cut me off, I'm going to keep asking questions, because I have one for Debo too, if anybody wants to stay on a little bit longer. I know we're up on time. Debo, can you speak a little bit to the challenges of sort of combining usage data and cost data in GKE, and sort of what things people are likely to run into when they start this journey of trying to understand their container costs?
Yeah, I mean, it's been touched on a little bit by some of the other colleagues that we've had talking here, but when it comes to combining usage data and cost data, I think what people are particularly looking most to do is to say, okay, at what level do I really want to label my usage so that I can make sure that the costs are clear on the other side? We've been dealing with a little bit of an alpha here on our side to take some of the usage that people are used to seeing, because in a lot of cases, they're used to seeing the GCE costs for their GKE, for example, and lining those up with clusters so they can see them in their BigQuery export. But the easiest way to get the most value out of that, at least for that tool, is to make sure that they've labeled their applications appropriately with the cost centers, the departments, whatever they have. So from that aspect, labeling their usage so that it makes sense in terms of the cost containers that they ultimately want to see has been a big thing that people should be doing, and we'll be releasing some tools in the very near future to help deal with that. So thinking about that early. The second part of it is, again, the requests versus consumption utilization, right? That's something that people won't be familiar with at first, but once they really get going and get more mature, they're going to be wanting to look at, right? And since we know that you're getting billed based on your requests, but your utilization is actually what you're responsible for, as a developer, you always want to make sure that you're not inflicting, cost pain on your greater organization, right? So if you know yourself that you're not necessarily utilizing as much as you're requesting, you may be doing that on purpose because you want to have that capability there when you need it. But if you know that your workloads are fairly stable, you want to see what cost optimization work you can do, right? So I think those two big things, labeling and usage optimization versus request optimization, have been the big sticking points for people getting started.
Excellent. Yeah, it's been fascinating to see that introduction of new level of data into this problem. So we are officially well over time, and I'm told we actually need to wrap up. So I wanted to thank everybody for joining, especially the speakers and everyone who asked questions. If you asked a question that we didn't get to, we're going to try and chase them asynchronously afterwards. A couple things to think about for later today. Today is FinOps Day. We've decided So we have another event happening later today that is specifically on AWS savings plan strategy. You can find out more about that on the FinOps.org blog. We're going to follow that with one on CUD strategy and Azure RI strategy as well. So if you want to get involved with that or join the Slack or connect with any of the folks here or the 2,000 practitioners, definitely go over to FinOps.org. Where you can get signed up, and hopefully we'll see you as part of the conversation as we move forward. So thank you, Debo, Sasha, Casey, Jonathan, and Webb. Really a pleasure. And for everybody who joined, appreciate your time and questions. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.